Hello, friends. Hello, watchers. Today we will look into a very important concept of all researchers and all research scholars, a kind of a skill and also knowledge that go hand in hand in making good research work. We have seen in our classes that research basically means research or searching again, but this is simply not the chaotic or random recurrence of search, but a systematized recurrence of search. So much searching again and again and again within a certain type of framework and design that the observations which are collected can be interpreted into a significant generalization, and that significant generalization can establish a relationship between facts or discover a new fact. So the basic principle of research is a search, but a systematized search and experimentation, observation, inference, conclusion. All these steps for deriving knowledge from that search are to be systematized. Now, if a research is to be systematized, the beginning is, of course, not just like any original moment of any process, not very defined, not very decisive, because if you have any priori decision at the very beginning of your research, that means that your research is already biased by a conclusion that you want to establish or a worldview that you want to impose, and therefore the research isn't a very good research. So at the very beginning of research, the moment is often very, very chaotic. And you go through the literature survey and you look into the existing amount of data produced by the earlier researchers in the domain, and you find the incompletions thereof, and you find the gaps thereof, and then you can focus upon your research objectives, and then you can centralize these research objectives or set up questions which work as objectives for your researcher. The answers of queries that you want to find out, you centralize them into the research question. Now, what happens is that because most of the supervisors have not been themselves trained when they were doing research by trained research methodologists. Therefore, there is a lacuna, especially in the domain of humanities, of losing the systematic methodology and going by some kind of a free play of good writing. But free play of good writing, however novel or however stylized, is never a good research. The research must validate itself through kind of a very, very systematic structure. And that structure, scientists, social scientists, or humanists do not count here. For any research in any field, that structure must be more or less maintained for the validity of the research to be good research. Now, for that purpose, what is required is that you have to first understand the difference between inquiries that work as your research objective and research question. Do not confuse the research question with your research objectives. The research objectives are the things that you want and your justification for your research, the queries which would justify your at all being in the ground of that research in the first place. And when you can centralize these research questions after peregrinating through the amount of labor given by the earlier researchers in that domain, finding out the incompletions and finding out the gaps or finding out the alternative possibilities of inferring, you arrive at the central question whose answer you do not know at the beginning of your research, but it bothers you and you want to find out the answer of that particular centralized question which unifies your research objectives. That particular, and I repeat, singular, 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 no matter wherever your supervisor had done his or her research from, at what age, and how many copies of that research work have been published in how much quanta of books. This is inviolable, that research question is always a singular research question. If it is plural, then they must be interdependent and unified into a kind of a singular field of inquiry. So after you arrive at that particular moment of singularity where you know whose answer you are trying to find out, you have to double check whether the research question which you are using as a research question, you know the possible answer of, or you don't know the possible answer of. If you already know the possible answer, then you are writing a very, very good book, but you are not doing a research. If the answer isn't known to you, only then you are doing a research, and at the end of the research, you will try to arrive at a possible answer. And the possibilities of answering. Now that the original moments of chaotic search or frantic search is no longer there, that you know what you are looking for and what is problematizing you is a particular question whose answers you want to follow, and you have already been able to formulate your null and alternative hypothesis, now it is the time for research design to be some kind of a plan that would show how the researcher would intend to fulfill the objectives of the proposed study. So the research design is some kind of a structured plan which indicates what kind of observations would be made and what type of theoretical frameworks would be adopted to provide answers to the research question based on the verifiable observations which are derived by the observational method, and how these observations will be made, and how the analytical and statistical procedures in case of science and social science, and interpretations and theoretical interventions in case of humanities are to be used once these data from the observations are collected. So, research design is some kind of a planned investigation, a plan of investigating through observation and inference in a systematic way to test the hypothesis. So the research design is for the process of collecting data from observation, the process of analyzing the data and interpreting these observed data. So it's a kind of a logical model, and the derivations from this model would be the proof that would allow you to test your hypothesis. So the research design is also the plan of generalizability, because you are looking into particular samples or particular representative parts of the whole population, because you cannot study the whole population. For example, if you want to do a research on monsters, you just cannot bring into your research the entire history of monsters in all the countries of the world and in all the communities. You have to choose samples, and samples are the representative units which would stand for by some kind of metonymic or synecdochal relationship or part for whole pattern for the entire population, and whatever data you observe and whatever analysis you make on these representative units would represent the entire population by some kind of internal analog or internal validity of replacing a larger whole by a smaller representative unit. So that is also part of the research design. So, what would be the components of a good research design? You begin with a research question, which would be defined and singular, and you will have a null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis, and you will have a clear indication of what kind of observations are made and how they are made, how data is collected. You will define your samples and justify your samples, and you will collect the data from the observation, and you will have a theoretical or statistical or analytical principle. You cannot be ad hoc in interpretations. As in the first chapter, you were a feminist, and in the second chapter, you were a misogynist, and in the third chapter, you are an androgenic muse, and the fourth chapter, you are a painter. This doesn't happen. You will have to maintain the integrity of the research interpretation. So the interpretations and analysis that you would attempt to be exercised upon the collected data from your observations, that would be kind of organically totality, and this totality is systematic, therefore it is a totality, and this totality is achieved by some kind of theoretical framework guiding as a principle all your temperaments, all your attempts of interpretation, so that your interpretations do not go wayward and the research doesn't lose its validity as a good research. Now, no matter how original and brilliant the hypothesis is, a poor research design may still produce insignificant conclusions, things which are already known. You're writing a good book, but nothing is discovered. That's not good research, and according to me and according to the best of the research methodologists, that would be unfit for awarding a PhD, no matter how popular that book might have been in the market of a book publishing industry. It is not fit for a PhD if the knowledge produced from it is only a kind of staccato and a kind of status quistic knowledge, and nothing new is discovered by it which was not known beforehand. So no matter how original is your writing, no matter how laborious and gargantuan your literature survey is, and no matter how brilliant the hypothesis is, a poor research design will produce insignificant and erroneous conclusions and would make the research unfit to be technically called a research at all. Now, at the very beginning of your research design, you need this singularity of research question, and you need, of course, your hypothesis, null and alternative ones, and you now have to define your experimentation. That is the first part of your research design. Now, experimentation is particularly important for the researchers in science and social science, but it is also not irrelevant for the students of humanities, because although we do not have technically that amount of experimental research, our research is basically analytical and non-experimental in the domain of, say, literary research. But you have to understand what is meant by experimentation, and then you understand how it is linked even to a literary study on Shakespeare or Dickens or sexual violence on Indian television, for example. Experimental research means a kind of a research design, which is designed in such a way that the researcher will be able to establish causal explanations for the variables, and to establish that causal explanations, he or she, the researcher, would be able to produce an environment in which he or she will have control over the independent variable. For example, suppose your alternative hypothesis is watching violence on television may cause people to engage in aggressive social behavior. Now, this is part of culture studies, and this is also part of popular cultural research. The independent variable here is the experimental stimulus, so to say, and that is the amount of violence watched on television. And the dependent variable is the frequency or the regularity with which people exhibit proportionate aggressive social behavior after watching that type of television series and serials. So, now how does a research scholar exercise the researcher's control over the experimental stimulus, and that is independent variable? In this case, in this particular case, where the hypothesis was watching violence on television causes people to engage in aggressive social behavior, the independent variable, as we have already seen, is the amount of violence watched on television. Now, the research scholar would be able to exercise control over this independent variable primarily at the level of sampling, because he or she may choose a sample which is quite full of aggressive behavior within the plot exercised by the protagonists and the antagonists. For example, he or she may choose something which has excessive and graphic violence per se in its rating, and officially something which is quite a violent movie or quite a violent TV series. Or he or she may also choose samples from children's films or animation or remaking of fairy tales, where one doesn't much expect overt violence on the screen, and try to find out by semiotic method or by feminist method or by other analytical frameworks the encoding of violence beneath the surface of apparently innocent, suitable for children content. So what the research scholar would pick up as a sample, he or she has a freedom here, because it is worthwhile to choose something which is very flatly, overtly, and transparently very, very violent and officially rated as violent content. It's also worthwhile to look into sites of television production, sites of representations of television series and serials and films which are screen texts not loaded overtly with violence, and find out the violence there. So the research scholar actually can experiment with the amount or the quanta of the experimental stimulus or the independent variable, and that is the amount of violence watched on television. So it's just like a scientist who is creating an ambience or an environment within his or her laboratory where particular controlled conditions are met, and within that environment of controlled conditions, the experiment before the observation is conducted, and the observations derived only within that controlled environment are taken up for analysis. It's just like that here in case of the humanities students also, although not directly or literally, but well, effectively. The next component of a good research design would be internal validity of the research design. Internal validity means dealing with the question, and it is very important for the research design to be accurate, dealing with the question whether the slight manipulation or variation in the independent variable makes a difference in the dependent variable. Because you see that the dependent variable, and in our literary studies, that is the effect, is to be related with the independent variable, and in the level of experimentation that is there in the research design, the researcher has access to some kind of, however minimal, control over the independent variable. So will that control make an artificial or manipulated effect on the dependent variable? If the amount of dependability is neutral to this manipulation, that no matter whatever manipulations you make, for example, you talk on Disney films and violence watched on television causes violence in the children who are watching it, or whether we're talking about sexually violent contents, for example, a film like Salo, or which is broadcast on television, or a film like Matribhumi, whether these would also induce the same kind of effect on the dependent variable, and that is aggressive social behavior incorporated within the watcher's mind and behavior, if in all cases, no matter whatever experimental manipulations in the independent variable you are making, the same cause and effect relationships tends neutral to and immune to the amount of manipulation or variation in the independent variable, then only that research has independent validity. I am giving you an example to you of what is an internally invalid research to make you understand what is internal validity in opposition to this example. Suppose you are working on, let's say, the link between monstrosity and homoeroticism. Now, the point is, if you are choosing the classic mythical monsters in a homophobic age a priori, homophobic cross-section of time and place in the ancient era, or in the medieval era, or in the time bygone, and if you are picking up instances from there, then this act of restricting your choices within a time zone would actually adversely affect the data, because if you are picking up the instances from time, from a society, from a period, from an episteme, or from a zeitgeist, which was by default very, very homophobic, and where coming out of the closet was strictly forbidden or silenced, then in the utterances like monster tales, monster stories, narratives of monsters, you will not find any kind of link between homoeroticity and monstrosity, other than designating the queer as a monstrous behavior or entity, and designating the monstrous as abnormal. But on the other hand, if you are picking up science fictions in which you are finding in the plot that the monsters are saving the human beings from the hands of machines, and there is some kind of polar opposition in a future inside the plot of the film or the narrative, where the biotic monsters are protecting us against robotic monsters, then you would find maybe entirely different results, because homosocial bonding among the sacrificial heroes in survival sci-fi would be very, very necessarily concentrating itself upon models of brotherhood of the savior army, and the monsters and the humans would have quite an amount of homosocial bonding when they are fighting against the emotionless robots or emotionless robotic or machine-made antagonists. So, internal validity would be the time and place, the cross-section from which you choose your samples. They must be not having an impact at all on the results of the collected data. Because in this particular example which we were talking about, picking up monsters from mythic times would definitely reduce the link of monstrosity and homoeroticity as inversely proportionate between good values and homoeroticity on one hand, and good values and monstrosity on one hand. So the monsters would be necessarily a kind of adjectives instead of working as nouns per se for homoerotic behavior, because the homoerotic behavior itself was designated monsters in the era from which you are picking up and restricting your experimental samples. On the other hand, if you are taking a diachronic approach here, and if you are not manipulating from which era would you pick up your samples from with a kind of manipulative and calculative gesture, if you are using random sampling techniques so that you have monsters which have good values and you have homoerotic behavior towards which the other characters in the narrative are more or less amicable, if not amiable, or in a future in which human beings' sexuality has been liberated by some kind of scientific revolution into ambisexual behavior or androgenic anatomical improvisation. In that particular types of narratives, you will find examples of the link between monstrosity and homoeroticity on the positive quadrant of values, instead of finding both of them in the negative quadrant of the values. So that research will have the internal validity while restricting the monsters and the homosexuals to be picked up from narratives from an age in which even monsters were forbidden to be homosexual, would definitely have an internal validity lost for that particular research. Now, there are some external validities for research in humanities, and research design must be careful about these external validities also. One is using a population for a particular research, whether it can be viably offering a model for an entirely different population. For example, for a semi-classical and internationally acclaimed folk dance form like Cho, and for an entirely hidden from general view and purview dance ritual by an endangered tribe in Amazonian rainforest. You cannot have all the findings to be universally applicable, so you cannot transpose the conceptual models which can be generalized from research on Cho on the other folk forms outside Cho, which are not semi-classical, which are not internationally acclaimed, which do not have any connection to the mainstream religious narratives and myths, which do not have the justification and patronizing mechanisms like one dance form may have vis-a-vis the elite culture, because the epics of the mainstream culture may not be the myths of the local and folk culture in all cases. In case of Cho, it is quite large in proportion analogy between the mainstream epic and the folk form, which is deriving its dance drama components from that mainstream Hindu epics. But it may be entirely different in case of another, let's say, tribal folk form, nowhere semi-classical. It may not have, in fact, any semblance to the mainstream epic, but in fact, it may be totally subversive from alpha to omega vis-a-vis the mainstream epic. So you may have a dance form in which the narrative from which the moments, from which the dramatic contexts are being derived in the folk dance are absolutely opposite to what the mainstream epic was depicting in the elite culture. So the models which are applicable in the first case are not universally applicable in the second case. So the research has a restricted external validity in the sense that outside its population, it cannot be applied validly to a different population. In some other research, it may be more externally valid in the sense that some amount of generalizability and applicability is accomplished within the research, so that in an entirely different population also, most of the inferences hold good. For example, if your research shows models of interpreting domestic violence, then in spite of the local variations and in spite of the historical contingencies being heterogeneous, it is largely applicable, at least the core moments and the core models, that patriarchy oppresses the masculine participant within it to become aggressive. It forces the masculine to be aggressive, and it forces or tends to force the feminine participant to be submissive. And this equation, which patriarchy forces upon the male to be masculine and aggressively so, and forces upon the female to be submissive and feminine, and this particular compulsion, which is a coercion on both the masculine and feminine participants in it, gives rise to the patriarchal inequation of power and social behavior, and domestic violence has links to it, because in all the cultures, no matter how liberated, how technologized, how modern, how first world and how much third world, how much ethnic and how much Eurocentric, how much poor or how much rich, you will find that the basic structure of domestic violence is based upon the assumed privilege given to the male to be aggressively masculine and the assumed compulsion imposed upon the female to be submissively feminine. So, if your population was a group of people in Holland, this has external validity to a group of people in Bangladesh also. So that is called external validity. Now, it is not important for all research, or it is not essential and necessary for all research to be externally valid, but it must be internally valid. And internal validation would be only achieved if your research design is designed in such a way that no manipulation or variation in the choice of the values for the independent variable would affect grossly any difference in the dependent variable. Your research design must also have, apart from the picking up of the correct research question, the formulation of the correct hypothesis, the choice of the correct sampling techniques, and the picking up of the correct samples, maintenance of internal validity, designing of experimentation, and in some cases attempting external validity. Apart from all this, your research design must have a theoretical framework within which your worldview, however eclectic, will never be haphazard or random. It will have some kind of organic or integral singularity, so to say. So you may choose to blend, say, visual semiotics and, let's say, French feminism. There is no problem in this mixing. In fact, eclectic approach would make your research better. However, you have to be very careful, because not all of the tools of the visual semiotics will be acceptable to the principles of French feminism, and not all of the principles or assumptions of French feminism would be parts of the research techniques used in semiotics. So these areas of mismatch, you have to be very, very careful, and you should be very cautious about the internal a priori conflicts in your theoretical framework from the very beginning. Otherwise, what happens is that your test results from your observed data, in spite of everything in your research design being very, very perfect, may vary very rarely and erratically at moments where the two approaches which you blended now become loggerheads. For example, I'm just giving you an example. Scopophilia, or the cinematic gaze, which is one of the major backbones of classic forms of optic inquiry through visual semiotics. And definitely feminism has certain agreements and, in fact, certain excitements within this domain. But at the same time, the femaleness, which is encouraged by the French feminists to be the ultimate state towards which all kinds of ethical feminism should move and flow, may completely stand outside the scope of scopophilia. And the way that the cinematic gaze is supposed to operate according to principles of visual semiotics, and the way in which female desire is to operate according to French feminism may come into conflicts. It is your duty to resolve the conflicts into some kind of truce, logically viable truce, before the theoretical framework can be applied to your observed data picked up from the samples, from the population, which was your target population defined in the research design for experimenting with. And only then your research will not only be good research in its talent, but also a good research in its structure.